Hey everybody, so in this video we're going to build user authentication for the Django Rest framework. And this token based authentication, it's simple, scalable, secure, and it works with any JavaScript frontend like Vue, React, Next.js, whatever. So in this video we'll implement the Django backend, and in future videos we'll embed that authentication into JavaScript frontends, which I'll link to at the end of this video. So let me show you how this backend authentication works. So you can see that we have this test.rest file, which we can use to test all our REST APIs. And we'll have a test for our signup method, our login API, and our test token API to make sure the token actually works. So you can guess what happens if we call the signup route. If we set a new username like Adam1 and we send that request, you can see that user is created and a new token is provided back to us. And then if we use that same username and password combination for our login API, you can see that's also going to pass to right here. Now finally, if we take that token and we pass it as a header into the test token API, you can see that it marks it as passed and this user is now authenticated. And you can guess some of the edge cases here, right? If we send the same username twice to the signup route, it will let us know that that username is taken. If we in fact set up a wrong username and password combo for login, you can see that that user is not found. And then if we make up a token that doesn't work for our test token API, you can see that the token is invalid and the respective APIs fail, right? So this video is simple enough for beginners who are looking to get started, but it's also concise enough for advanced coders that are looking for something quick. And we'll stand this project up by A, setting up a Django project, B, adding the Django Rest framework in the Auth Token module into our settings, and then we'll set up a login, sign up, and test token route for each URL. We'll implement the methods for each API, and then we'll test them finally with that test.rest file. And after that, you're fully good to go. So the code can also be cloned from the link in the bio if you're in a real rush, but without wasting any more time, let's just start coding the app. So to start, let's set up a Django project, which will add all of the code inside of. So first step is let's open up a terminal and set up a new project folder. So I'm gonna CD into my desktop because that's where I'm gonna put it, but you can put this project wherever you want in your computer. Now I'm going to name this project by creating a new directory and calling it Django tutorial. And of course, you can name it whatever you want. So now that that folder is open, I'm going to CD into Django tutorial, and I'm going to run code space dot to open it in VS Code. Now you can also just drag and drop this folder onto VS Code and open it the exact same way. Now that we have this project folder open in VS Code, the first thing we want to do is set up a Python virtual environment. Now, a Python virtual environment is a folder in your project that hosts your Python version and all of your dependencies. The reason this is useful is because let's say you had 5 or 6 Python projects on your computer, and some are using Python 2, some are using Python 3, some have dependencies of one version versus another. It becomes really hard to manage all these Python versions and dependency versions on your computer. So if you could have a little folder here that stores your Python version and all the dependencies, it becomes really easy to manage. So that's what we're going to set up to start. So the first step is let's open up a terminal, and I'm going to run this in Python 3. So I'm going to run Python 3 space -v, and you can see I have Python 3.9. I think any late version of Python should work for this video, so don't worry if it's Python 3.10 or something else. But what I'm going to do is run Python 3-m venv for virtual environment, and I'm going to name it venv as well. Now, once this command completes, you can see this virtual environment folder got set up here, and we can activate it by running activate source, or actually it's source venv /bin/activate. And that activates this virtual environment in our terminal. So now you can see this little icon on the left, and we're good to go. So the first thing I want to do is I want to validate that the right Python version is in place. So if I run Python-v now, without the 3, you can see that it's now Python 3.9. So we know that 3.9 is running in this virtual environment. and I'm going to update the pip to the latest. So pip install -- upgrade pip. I always do this when I start a virtual environment, just make sure pip is as late as possible because they patch bugs. Now with the latest pip, the first dependency we want to install is of course Django. So let's run pip install Django. Great. So we have Django up and running now. The first thing I actually want to add in terms of files here is a .gitignore. And I'm going to add them into the gitignore so that when we add this first Django project to Git, it's not going to add all of these files that we don't need. Perfect. Okay, so we have our virtual environment set up. We have a .gitignore set up. Now what we want to do is start this Django project. So what we have to do is run Django-admin start project, all one word, and then I'm going to call it server and add a dot at the end so it sets up the project in this Django tutorial folder. So now that that's complete, you can see a manage.py file was created, which is the main file to run the Django app. And then we also have settings.py, which is going to host all our settings and URLs for the default URLs this Django app has. So this is a great place to start. Now, the first two commands I want to run is /manage.py, or actually I'll run Python manage.py migrate, which will set up the database for this Django app. So you can see db.sqlite3. And the last command I want to run is Python manage.py run server. Now with these commands in place, you can see this Django app is running at this location right here. So if I open up my Chrome browser and I paste that URL in, Calciprese, we now have Django up and running. The last thing I want to do for this boilerplate Django app is just add the database into the gitignore because we don't want to add our database into our Git repository. So db.sqlite3. And we should be good to go. Now in a new terminal, I can just write git init, git add space dot to check in all of these files. And you can see that Venv and SQLite are grayed out, which is great. Git commit -m first commit. And we now have a Git repo up and running. Perfect. So we have a boilerplate Django project up and running. Now let's start adding the code for our project inside of it. So the next part of this project is really easy. We're going to add the Django Rest framework and we're going to add the Auth Token module, both of those into our project settings so that we can set up REST endpoints on our Django project and authenticate users through that Auth Token module. Sounds very complicated, but it's actually the easiest part of this video, so let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to expand VS Code just to make sure you can all see it. Perfect. And then what I'll do is I'll install two dependencies. So let's go back to where our server is running and run Control-C to stop the server. And we'll run pip install Django Rest framework. And we want to make sure that that Venv icon is still there. Perfect. So now that we have that in place, there are two things that we need to add into our app installed apps. We want to add the REST framework and the REST framework.auth token. So go into settings, Command F, installed apps. Great. So we want to add the REST_framework, and we also want to add REST framework.auth token. Great. And now these two apps are in place, which will allow us to make API calls with REST and authenticate users with REST auth tokens. So let's rerun the server. So Python manage.py run server. And that app should look a little bit different. Oh, and we have to run migrate to set up the auth token models. So Control-C again, Python manage.py migrate. You should see some auth token tables get created in our database. And let's run this one more time. Great. Now, if we hop over to this Django app and we refresh, it should look a little different. Maybe not. Okay, well, we'll progress assuming that it worked because it should. And let's go ahead and set up the API endpoints for sign up, login, and testing our auth token now. Now that our Django project is set up with the Django Rest framework, let's make 3 APIs for login, sign up, and testing our auth token. So the first thing I want to do is I actually want to go and set up a views.py file. So right click, new file, views.py. Now what this will allow us to do is run Python code for any API whenever it gets called. So I'm going to import a few things from the Django Rest framework to start. So from rest_framework.decorators, import API view. Now this allows you to execute views that are invoked via a REST API. And the second thing I want to do is from rest framework dot response import response. And this allows you to generate those JSON responses in response to REST APIs. Great. So the first thing I want to do is create a new API view, and I want this to run whenever a post call is made. And whenever a post call is made, we're going to run a method called login to start. And it's going to take a request as a part of its body. Now, all we're going to do to start is just return an empty response object. Perfect. And we'll create 2 more functions, one for signup and one for test token. Great. Now, what else I want to do is map those views to certain routes within our URLs. So let me delete a few things here. So I'll get rid of all these comments. There we go. And I want to import repath, and I want to delete path here. And I also want to get rid of the admin route just to keep things simple. Cool. So we're going to add a regex path for whenever login is called, and we're going to call views.login. Now, of course, we need to import views. Sweet. Now we'll want to do the same thing for sign up and test token. So sign up, test token. Great. So we have an API for login, an API for sign up, and an API for test token. And whenever we make a post request to any of these, it just returns an empty JSON object. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to create that test.rest file, which will allow us to test these API calls. Now, one thing I want to note is that you'll need to install the REST client plugin within VS Code. So if you go to this REST client here and you install it, it's going to make this REST file interactive, and you'll see exactly what I mean. So let me paste a little bit of REST code in here. So you can see that if we make a post request to this localhost/login, make the content type application JSON, and we specify a username and password, that will invoke the first call. Now the second one for sign up is that we just make a post request to the localhost/signup, and we specify a user body. And the last one I just want to copy and paste is one for test token. And this one will just have an empty body within it. Actually, for this one, let's make it a GET request, and we'll hop back to views. And for test token, let's make it only take a GET request as well. Great. Now what we're going to be able to do is within these REST requests, you can see this little button that says send request just above it. And it should return empty JSON objects for each one of these requests. And then last but not least for test token. Great. So this means all APIs are working, but there's no Python code actually within the APIs themselves, right? We're just returning empty JSON objects. So in the next section of this video, let's add the logic to login, to signup, and to test token to create users, authenticate them, and then make sure their auth token actually works. So for the final section of this video, let's start adding the Python calls, the Python code to our signup API, our login API, and our test token API to create new users, authenticate existing users, and test their tokens respectively. So let's get started. Now we'll start with the signup API. And in order to do that, the first thing we'll want to do is create a mechanism that maps JSON objects to entries in our database. And we can do that with something called serializers. Again, this sounds complicated, but it's really not after you see one example. So let's do that right now. Create a new file called serializers.py and just write the following code. So we're going to import something from the REST framework called serializers, and we're going to import the user model from Django. And what this will allow us to do is create a class called a user serializer, which inherits from a model serializer. And again, it allows us to map JSON objects from APIs to entries in our database, which is super important. So in order to make this work, declare the class, create a subclass called meta, and pass an object. And we'll need to set the model to user, right? The Django user model. And the fields we'll want are ID, username, password, and email from that model. Great. So we have our serializers in place to map JSON objects to entries in our user table. Now let's go back to views, and we'll need to import a few things in order to make the signups work. So I'm going to put the 4 imports right here, and I'll explain them now. So of course we're going to want to import that user serializer, which will allow us to write JSON objects into our database. And then we're going to want to be able to return the status code for our API calls. So if a user is created, we want to return a 201. If it's a bad request, we want to return a 400. That object allows us to do it. We'll also want to import the user model and the token model so that we can fetch and create users and tokens from our database. Now with these 4 imports in place, we're good to start writing the Python code. So what we're going to do is initialize a serializer based on the request data that came in for our signup call. So serializer is equal to user serializer, where the data is equal to the request data we just got from that request or API. Awesome. Now, if this data is valid, right, i.e. if serializer.is_valid with parentheses, then we should save this new user into our database. So run serializer.save. Now, once this user is written into our database, we can now retrieve that user by saying user is equal to user.objects.get, where the username is equal to request.data and then username as a key. Great. So we have the user. Now we want to create a token for that user because they just signed up. So token is equal to token.objects.create, where the user is equal to that user object. And then last but not least, we want to return that user JSON and the token so that they can the React app can take that token and make API calls with it, etc. So return response, create a JSON object where the token is equal to token.key and the user is equal to serializer.data. Awesome. Now, last but not least, we actually want to make sure that the user's password is a hashed password. So make sure that we set the user's password by passing in request.data password and then user.save. Now, the reason this is important is because the password field's actually unique in the sense that we don't store the plain password, we store a hashed version of the password for security purposes. So setting the password with this function allows us to do that. Awesome. And last but not least, if the data for the serializer is not valid, just return the serializer dot errors. Cool. And then we'd want to make the status equal to status dot 400 for bad data. Cool. So again, we get that serializer instance based on the data passed in our request. If it's valid, i.e. there's a username, a password, and an email, we'll create that user, we'll fetch it and set their password properly, and then we'll create a token for that user and return their data. Now we should be good to test this API call. So if we go back to test.rest and we go to the post/signup with application JSON with a username, a password, and an email, and we send that request, that username already exists. Okay, so let's do Zach1. Perfect. So Zach1 now exists in our database, and if we call that a second time, that username already exists. So this signup route is now working. Now what we'll want to do is carry on with the login route as well as the test token route. So let's start carrying on. So we'll go to login next. So what we'll want to do is fetch that user based on their username, and if they don't exist, return a 404, and then check if the password matches that is provided, and if it matches, return the user. If not, return a 404 once again. So user is equal to something we'll need to import, which is get object or 404 from Django shortcuts. And what we'll want to do is find a user object where the username is equal to request.data username. And again, if that username does not match, we're going to return a 404 error. Now, if the password does not match, so i.e. if user check password for request.data password is false, if not, then we're going to want to return that 404. So this response body right here, where it says detail not found with 404, is the exact same response from this function here, which is important because we don't want to give away if the username was correct or the password was correct. We just want to return the same response every time. Great. Now, assuming that we found the user and the password matches, we want to get their token, right? So token is equal to token.objects.get. We'll say or create if it wasn't made for some reason in the past, where user is equal to user. And we'll have to create a created parameter here. And then this allows us to return the same response that we had down here, which I'll just copy and paste. And I guess the last thing we'll need is the serializer. So serializer is equal to user serializer, where we just pass in instance is equal to user. Cool. So we should be good to test that login route as well now. So if we do Zach1 with pass1234, it works and we see that user's data and their token, which I'll copy right now. And then of course, if we do something like Zach12 who doesn't exist, we get a 404. And if we do a correct username but a bad password and we send that request, we also get a 404. So this is working perfectly. Now, the last thing that we really want to do is set up a method to test our auth tokens to make sure that they work for forbidden requests. So let's do that now. So to complete this tutorial, we want to be able to take an auth token passed in a request and retrieve the respective user and make sure that they're authenticated. And that's what we're going to do with this test token API right here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a few imports and a few decorators that we'll need, and then what they allow us to do. So we'll want to import the authentication classes and permission classes decorators. And within REST framework authentication, we'll want session authentication and token authentication. Now this allows us to authenticate sessions with a token. And then last but not least, we just want to make sure we have the isAuthenticated class so that we declare that an API only works if that user is authenticated. And we add these respective decorators here. So an API view for get, we set the authentication classes to session and token authentication. And then for permission classes, we want to make sure that the user is authenticated. And then if that passes and this function gets invoked, the token cross-referencing has been completed and we will be able to see that user within the request data. So if I say that it passed for and then run .format request.user.email, this should say that the request passed for the email of the user whose token we just provided. Now, with this in place, we're done. So let's go back to the request rest. We'll log in as Zach1. So let me put in the right password. Right? So here's the token, right? And we know that the email is zach@gmail.com. And if we go to test this token, so if we come back here, we go down, authorization, token space, and enter that token, and we send this request, we see that it passed for zach@gmail.com. Now again, in order to make these requests work, we need to set as a header the authorization key and then token space in that token we just provided. And assuming that we do that, Django on the back end magically looks at that token with token authentication, cross-references it with the database to see if that user is authenticated, and if it is, it adds that user as a request.user, and we can pull their email and assume they're authenticated and do whatever we need to do, right? Set up subscriptions, post new objects on our marketplace, whatever you want. So I just went through a lot of code, but again, in a nutshell, what we did is we stood up a Django project. Within the settings of that Django project, we declared the REST framework and the REST framework auth token module. We set up a URL to log in users, sign them up, and test their web tokens. And this creates new users and web tokens if they sign up, fetches that user if they exist in their token, and then the last call allows us to test that token and cross-reference it with the correct user, which gets passed into the request if they're in fact authenticated, making sure that the auth token in fact works. So that's everything you need to know in order to get a fully blown authenticated Django REST framework web app up and running. So please let me know if you have any questions, and of course, thank you for watching.